Welcome back to Stories of Hammer. Today, we're exploring one of the most harrowing and fascinating scenarios in the grim darkness of the far future. Imagine this. An ancient warrior, entombed in adamantium and ceramite, has been sleeping for nearly 3 millennia. His dreams, if you can call them that, are fractured memories of battles fought when the Imperium was younger, when his chapter still remembered the names of heroes now lost to time. And then, in the darkness of his eternal slumber, something changes. Rough hands pound against his sarcophagus. Crude tools scrape against blessed metal. Guttural voices shout in a language that sounds like violence given form. The Orks have found him. This is not a story of hope. This is not a tale of glorious awakening to save the Imperium one more time. This is something far more terrible and far more real in the unforgiving galaxy of Warhammer 40,000. This is about what happens when two of the universe's most implacable forces collide in the worst possible circumstances. An ancient Dreadnought, his mind already teetering on the edge of dissolution after millennia of dreamless sleep, confronting Xenos, who see him not as a revered hero, but as the most magnificent piece of scrap they've ever laid eyes on. The horror of this scenario runs deeper than simple combat. We're talking about a being who has already paid the ultimate price for his service to the Emperor. A space marine who should have died with honor on some forgotten battlefield, instead preserved in a walking tomb, his broken body sustained by ancient technology and his consciousness locked in an existence that makes true death seem like mercy. He's been sleeping for 2,750 years. To put that in perspective, when this warrior last walked and talked and fought, the Imperium might have been in the midst of the age of apostasy, or perhaps even earlier. The enemies he knew, the tactics he mastered, the very language he spoke, all of it could be radically different from the galaxy he's about to wake up to. And who wakes him? Not his battle brothers. Not tech marines who would ease him gently into consciousness with sacred rituals and careful preparation. No, it's the Orks, the green-skinned scourge of the galaxy, who view everything through the lens of two simple questions. Is it good for a fight? And can we loot it? To them, this towering war machine is the answer to both questions, and they're going to find out just how good for a fight it really is. What makes this encounter particularly fascinating is the clash of philosophies it represents. The Imperium views dreadnoughts as sacred relics, walking shrines to heroes of the past, vessels of wisdom and living history. Every moment they spend conscious is carefully measured. Every battle they fight is chosen with deliberation. Every word they speak is recorded and studied. The Orks, on the other hand, operate on a much simpler principle. Find the biggest, most dangerous thing you can, and either fight it or make it fight for you. There's a beautiful, terrible irony in a being who represents the Imperium's desperate attempt to preserve its heroes forever, encountering a species that represents the galaxy's capacity for mindless, joyful destruction. The stakes here are immense on multiple levels. For the Dreadnought, this awakening could mean the difference between a warrior's death and something far worse. For the Orks, this discovery could be the greatest prize of their entire wag, or it could be a massacre that teaches even greenskins to fear. For the Imperium, if they even learn of this encounter, it represents the potential loss of irreplaceable knowledge and a link to their past, or possibly the recovery of an ancient hero who can share wisdom from a forgotten age. But before we can truly understand what happens when these two forces meet, we need to understand each of them separately. We need to comprehend the reality of what it means to be a dreadnought, to exist in that state for thousands of years. We need to grasp the Ork mentality, their relationship with technology, and why a discovery like this would drive them into a frenzy of excitement and violence. Only then can we truly appreciate the full horror and wonder of what unfolds when a mech boy's crude tools first bite into ancient ceramite, and an intelligence that has been dormant for longer than most civilizations have existed begins to stir. The walking tombs. Understanding the Dreadnought. To truly comprehend the magnitude of what we're discussing, we must first understand what a Dreadnought actually is, and more importantly, what it means to be one. These aren't simply large suits of armor or advanced vehicles. They're something far more profound and far more terrible. They're prisons made of the Imperium's finest technology, containing what's left of warriors who earned both the honor and the curse of serving beyond death. When a space marine suffers wounds so catastrophic that even their enhanced physiology cannot recover, when their body is broken beyond the considerable abilities of the chapter's apothecaries to repair, they face a choice that isn't really a choice at all. They can accept the Emperor's peace, the mercy of a clean death, or they can be interred within a Dreadnought. This is presented as a great honor, and in many ways, it is. To continue serving, to remain a part of your chapter, to fight alongside your brothers for centuries or even millennia beyond your natural span, this is the stuff of legend. But the reality is far darker than the ceremony suggests. The process of becoming a Dreadnought is horrific. What remains of the Marine's body, often little more than a torso, vital organs, and most importantly, the brain, is placed within an armored sarcophagus filled with life-sustaining amniotic fluids. Neural interfaces wire directly into what's left of their nervous system, connecting their consciousness to the sensors, weapons, and locomotor systems of the Dreadnought chassis. Every sensation they once knew, every way they experienced the world, is filtered through mechanical systems. They no longer see with eyes, they see through optical sensors. They don't hear with ears, they hear through acoustic pickups. Touch becomes pressure readings on armor plating. They are, in the most literal sense, more machine than man. The Dreadnought's body, what we see stomping across battlefields, is an impressive war machine by any standard. Standing somewhere between 12 and 15 feet tall, depending on the pattern, these walking tanks are armored with ceramite and adamantium, materials that can withstand hits from lascannons and plasma weapons that would vaporize lesser vehicles. The castroferum pattern, the most common type seen in the 41st millennium, is a boxy, angular design that's been the standard for thousands of years. It's not the fastest or most elegant, but it's reliable and devastating in combat. Older patterns like the Contemptor are sleeker and more advanced, but the technology to create new ones has been lost, making each one an irreplaceable relic. Some ancient dreadnoughts date back to the Great Crusade itself, to the age when the Emperor still walked among men and the Imperium was young and hopeful. But here's where the real horror begins. The human mind, even a Space Marine's enhanced mind, was never meant to exist in this state indefinitely. Extended neural interface with something as large and complex as a dreadnought creates immense mental stress. The condition is well documented. Lethargy, confusion, dyschronometria, which is the inability to accurately perceive time, and eventually, senility. The longer a Marine remains conscious within their metal tomb, the more their mind deteriorates. They lose track of who they were. Memories fade. Emotions become muted and distant. Time loses all meaning when you've been awake for centuries. When one battle blurs into another. When the faces of your battle brothers change, as generations live and die while you endure. This is why dreadnoughts sleep. When they're not needed for battle, when their wisdom isn't required for counsel, tech Marines place them into stasis vaults, essentially freezing their consciousness to prevent further degradation. In this state, they experience nothing. No dreams, no passage of time, just void. When they're awakened, it's as if no time has passed at all, which creates its own kind of horror. Imagine closing your eyes in one moment and opening them centuries later, with no sense that any time has elapsed. The world you knew is gone. The people you served with are dust. The very Imperium you fought for has changed in ways you might not recognize. Most dreadnoughts are awakened periodically, at least once a century, sometimes more often if the chapter faces dire threats. This regular cycle, while still taxing, keeps them somewhat grounded in the present. They see the slow evolution of their chapter. They witness the passage of time through the eyes of their brothers. They maintain some connection, however tenuous, to the living world. But what happens when this cycle breaks? What happens when a dreadnought is lost, forgotten, or simply abandoned in the chaos of war? This is where our scenario becomes particularly nightmarish. 2,750 years of uninterrupted sleep. That's not just a long time, it's an incomprehensible gulf of years. To put this in perspective, if this dreadnought went to sleep during the age of apostasy in the 36th millennium, he's sleeping through massive portions of Imperial history. The Badab War, countless WH40s, Tyranid invasions, the 13th Black Crusade, potentially even the return of Guilliman and the beginning of the Indomitus Crusade. The galaxy this warrior knew is gone, replaced by something that might be utterly alien to him. But it's not just the external changes that matter. It's what happens to the mind during such extended stasis. While the stasis is meant to preserve consciousness and prevent degradation, it's not perfect. The organic components of the brain still age, however slowly. Neural pathways can degrade, and when consciousness finally does return, after such an extended absence, there's no guarantee that the person who went to sleep is the same person who wakes up. Some dreadnoughts who have endured extremely long periods of sleep report strange effects. They speak of dreams, which shouldn't be possible in stasis. They describe voices in the darkness, conversations with other entombed warriors whose sarcophagi might be nearby. Some claim to experience the entire history of their sleep compressed into moments, while others insist that they experience true nothingness so complete that they question whether they existed at all during their slumber. The technical term for these experiences doesn't matter as much as what they represent. Evidence that even in stasis, the mind is not truly at rest. There's also the question of what information is lost. Dreadnoughts are valued not just as weapons, but as living libraries. They remember battles, tactics, enemies, and chapter history that might otherwise be forgotten. But memory is fragile, even for a space marine. Each time a dreadnought is awakened, there's a risk that some memories won't return, that some piece of precious knowledge will be gone forever, dissolved in the darkness of extended sleep. After nearly 3,000 years, how much would be left? How much of the man who was first interred in that sarcophagus would remain? The dreadnought chassis itself also presents challenges after such extended dormancy. These are ancient machines, maintained through a combination of technical expertise and religious ritual. Tech Marines treat them with reverence, anointing them with sacred oils, performing benedictions to the machine spirit, ensuring that every system is functioning perfectly before awakening the pilot. But if a dreadnought has been lost or forgotten, who's been performing this maintenance? How many systems might have failed? How much damage might have accumulated from simple neglect or the ravages of time? Consider the life support systems that keep the pilot alive. They need to maintain the amniotic fluids at precise temperatures and chemical compositions. They need to provide nutrients, remove waste, regulate the biological functions that keep what's left of the body viable. If any of these systems fail, even partially, the results could be catastrophic. The pilot might wake to find themselves in agony, their body poisoned by their own waste products, their flesh rotting in corrupted fluids. Or they might not wake at all, their mind preserved but their body dead, a consciousness trapped in a corpse. The neural interfaces present another point of potential failure. These delicate systems connect the pilot's brain to the dreadnought's systems, translating thought into action, sensory input into something the mind can process. Degradation of these interfaces could result in sensory distortion, motor control problems, or even complete disconnection, leaving the pilot conscious but unable to interact with the world in any meaningful way. Imagine waking after thousands of years to find yourself blind, deaf, unable to move or speak, trapped in absolute sensory deprivation with no way to communicate your torment. The weapon systems too require consideration. Dreadnoughts carry devastating armaments, from assault cannons and lascannons to close combat weapons that can tear through armor like paper. These weapons require power, ammunition, and maintenance. After so long dormant, would they even function? Would the targeting systems still be calibrated? Would the power feeds still connect? Or would our ancient warrior awaken to find himself armed with nothing but dead weight, his weapons as obsolete as the enemies he once faced? And then there's the machine spirit itself. In the Imperium's understanding of technology, complex machines possess something akin to a soul, a quasi-sentient intelligence that must be respected and propitiated. The machine spirit of a dreadnought is considered particularly powerful, shaped by centuries of service and countless battles. But what happens to a machine spirit after thousands of years of silence? Does it sleep as the pilot sleeps? Does it dream its own mechanical dreams? And when awakened, will it still remember its purpose? Or will it have become something strange and unpredictable? All of these factors combine to create a scenario of extraordinary complexity and danger. When our hypothetical dreadnought awakens after 2,750 years, he won't simply boot up like a computer from sleep mode. He'll be thrust from absolute nothingness into sensation and consciousness, his ancient systems struggling to restart, his mind grappling with the void he's returning from, his body, such as it is, reconnecting with mechanical systems that have been dormant for longer than many star systems have been part of the Imperium. And in that moment of vulnerable confusion, disoriented and potentially malfunctioning, he'll have to confront the reality that the first things he sees after nearly 3 millennia aren't his battle brothers coming to wake him for another glorious campaign. It's Orks hammering at his armor, trying to either loot him for parts or figure out how to make him fight for them. The psychological shock alone could be devastating. The practical implications are even worse. The Green Tide, understanding the Orks. To understand why this encounter is so catastrophic, we need to understand the other half of our equation. The Orks are not merely enemies of the Imperium. They're a fundamental force of the galaxy, a species so alien in their thinking and yet so terrifyingly effective in their methods that they've been a scourge since before the Imperium existed. They're the galaxy's ultimate expression of might makes right, where the biggest, strongest, and loudest rule absolutely, and where violence isn't just accepted, it's the entire point of existence. Orks are, at their core, a weapon species created by long-dead gods. Genetically engineered by the Old Ones during the war in heaven millions of years ago, they were designed to be the perfect soldiers, combining the physiological features of both animals and fungi to create a self-replicating military force that could be seeded on any world and left to multiply. Unlike humans, who must carefully manage reproduction and child-rearing, Orks spread through spores released at death or during periods of rapid growth. These spores grow into the various orkoid subspecies, first snotlings, who tend the fungus gardens, then Gretchen, who perform menial labor, and finally, the Orks themselves, born from the ground already knowing how to fight, how to build crude weapons, and how to wage war. This fungal reproduction gives Orks an enormous strategic advantage. You can kill every Ork on a planet and think you've won, only to have a new wag emerge from the spores they left behind 50 years later. They don't need supply lines in the traditional sense. They don't need rear echelon support. Every Ork is a warrior first, and while they have specialized castes, every single greenskin, from the smallest grot to the largest war boss, can and will fight. It's literally written into their genetic code. The Ork psyche is fundamentally different from human understanding. They experience joy in violence. They laugh as they charge into gunfire. They see war not as a terrible necessity, but as the highest form of existence, the ultimate good time. This isn't stupidity or ignorance. It's what they were designed for. An orc who dies in battle dies happy, knowing he fought well. An orc who lives through a battle wants nothing more than to find an even bigger fight tomorrow. There's no war weariness with orcs. No trauma. No moral qualms about the violence they inflict or endure. They are perhaps the only species in the galaxy that experiences the horrors of endless war as pure joy. But here's where it gets truly interesting. Orcs aren't stupid. They're crude, yes. They're savage, absolutely. But they're not mindless. They have culture, politics, and social hierarchies. They have art, music, and even religion, though it all revolves around fighting and violence. More importantly, they have technology, and this is where our scenario becomes particularly relevant. Orc technology is one of the great enigmas of the 40k universe. It shouldn't work. It really shouldn't. Weapons slapped together from scrap metal, held together with crude welds and bolts, with parts that don't match, and tolerances that would make any human engineer weep. And yet, in orc hands, these ramshackle contraptions function. A shooter made from scrap, duct tape, and pure. Orcish confidence will fire just fine when an orc pulls the trigger. But hand that same weapon to a human, and it becomes an unreliable mess, as likely to explode as to shoot. The secret lies in the orc's latent psychic ability, the gestalt psychic field that all orcs generate collectively, known as the WH40 energy. This isn't individual psychic power like a human psyker wields. Most individual orcs aren't psychic at all. But collectively, when enough orcs believe something strongly enough, reality bends slightly to accommodate that belief. Red vehicles go faster because orcs believe red makes things faster. Weapons work because orcs believe they work. It's not that the technology is fake or that belief alone makes it function. The underlying principles are sound. The mechanical basis is real. But the WH40 field fills in the gaps, makes up for the shoddy construction, compensates for the lack of precision engineering. This is important because it means orc technology, while crude, can be remarkably effective and incredibly adaptive. Mech boys, the orc engineer caste, don't learn their craft through study. They're born with instinctive knowledge of how to build things, genetic memories programmed into them by the old ones millions of years ago. From a very young age, mech boys see visions of machines, weapons, and devices. They understand mechanical principles at an intuitive level that would take human engineers years of study to grasp. They don't know why their designs work, they just know that they do. Mech boys are essential to any orc warband, or WH40. They maintain the ramshackle vehicles that orcs charge into battle with. They build the guns that orc boys carry. They create everything from simple choppers to complex devices like the shock attack gun, which literally teleports snotlings through the warp to emerge inside enemy vehicles or armor. The biggest and most talented mech boys, called big mechs, can even create force fields, teleportation devices, and other technologies that rival or exceed what the Imperium can produce. But perhaps most relevant to our scenario is the orc cultural obsession with looting. Orcs don't just scavenge equipment from defeated enemies, they revel in it. The entire Death Skulls clan has built their entire identity around being the best looters in the galaxy. They believe that looted equipment is lucky, that items taken from defeated enemies carry the strength of those enemies with them. A looted Lehman Russ tank isn't just a captured vehicle to an orc. It's a trophy, a prize, and proof that the orc who took it is strong enough to beat the enemies who used to own it. When orcs find something valuable on a battlefield, they don't leave it behind. Scrap teams, usually comprised of Gretchen under the supervision of larger orcs, scour battle sites even while the fighting is still ongoing, hauling off damaged vehicles, weapons, and anything else that looks useful. These captured items are then brought to mech boys who set about improving them. This improvement usually involves adding more guns, more armor, more dakka, painting it in appropriately orky colors, and generally making it louder, cruder, and more violent. The result is the looted wagon, a catch-all term for any vehicle that Orks have captured and modified for their own use. Looted rhinos become troop transports for Ork boys. Looted Leman Russ tanks get festooned with extra weapons and painted red to make them go faster. Even land raiders and other Imperial armor can be found in Ork warbands, if the Orks were lucky or skilled enough to capture them. There's even a legendary looter named Grabber Gutsbag, who supposedly managed to loot entire Imperial titans. Orks view technology in a fundamentally different way than the Imperium does. Where the Imperium sees sacred machine spirits that must be propitiated with ritual and prayer, Orks see stuff that can be improved by hitting it with a wrench and adding more guns. Where human tech priests carefully maintain ancient systems according to rituals passed down through generations, mech boys just hammer bits together until they work. And because of the WAG field, this crude approach often succeeds where it has no right to. This cultural and technological context is crucial for understanding what happens when Orks encounter an ancient Imperial Dreadnought. To them, this isn't a sacred relic containing the honored remains of a fallen hero. It's not a walking shrine to be treated with reverence and respect. It's the most amazing piece of loot they've ever seen. It's a walking tank with guns and claws and thick armor. It's a mystery to solve, a challenge to overcome, and a prize worth fighting over. It's everything an Ork could want: dangerous, valuable, and covered in dakka. The mech boys who find it will be beside themselves with excitement. Here's something they've never seen before, or at least not intact. Here's ancient technology that could teach them new tricks, new designs, new ways to make things that go boom. Here's a power plant that could run a dozen looted vehicles. Here's weapons systems they could study and replicate. Here's armor plating thick enough to stop shots that would destroy lesser vehicles. And somewhere inside all that metal and ceramite, there might even be something alive. Something that could be interrogated or forced to reveal its secrets. But more than the practical value, there's the prestige. The mech boy who successfully captures, studies, and loots an Imperial Dreadnought would gain enormous status among his peers. He could probably parlay that success into leading his own warband, maybe even challenging his war boss for leadership if he felt like he'd gotten big enough from the achievement. Among the speed-obsessed cult of speed, he could build the fastest vehicle anyone's ever seen. Among the bad moons, wealthy from their faster-growing teeth, he could sell his discoveries for enough teeth to buy his own army. The possibilities are as limitless as an Ork's imagination, which, while not sophisticated, is enthusiastically violent. This fundamental difference in perspective is what makes our scenario so horrific. The Dreadnought, if he were to be found by his own chapter or any Imperial forces, would be treated with the utmost reverence. Tech Marines would approach carefully, checking systems, preparing sacred unguents and oils, speaking benedictions to the machine spirit. The awakening would be gradual, gentle, with familiar voices speaking in Gothic, with squad markings he might recognize, with the comforting sounds of Imperial technology humming around him. Instead, he's going to wake to the sound of Orks, hammering, yelling, arguing in their guttural language about how best to open this new treasure. Crude tools scarring sacred metal, rough hands poking and prodding at systems they don't understand. And when his systems finally do restart, when consciousness returns after nearly 3,000 years, the first thing he's going to see through his optical sensors are green faces, tusked and leering, as mech boys try to figure out how to make him fight for them. The discovery, how this nightmare begins. The question now becomes, how does a Space Marine Dreadnought, one of the Imperium's most precious war machines, end up lost for nearly 3,000 years in a place where Orks can find it? The answer lies in the chaotic nature of war in the 41st millennium, and the sheer vastness of the galaxy itself. In a setting where entire worlds can be forgotten, where fleets disappear in the warp, never to be seen again, where battlefields stretch across continents and conflicts last for centuries, losing track of a single dreadnought, however valuable, is not just possible, but almost inevitable. Let's consider the most likely scenario. The Dreadnought was lost during a catastrophic battle. Not just any battle, but one of those apocalyptic engagements that the Imperium specializes in, where an entire chapter might be committed to defending a strategically vital world or prosecuting a crusade against a particularly dangerous enemy. In the chaos of such a conflict, especially if the battle goes badly, it's entirely possible for a Dreadnought to become separated from his chapter, to be buried under rubble, or to sink into a swamp or ocean, where recovery becomes impossible in the immediate aftermath. Perhaps the battle was against chaos forces, a black crusade, or a demonic incursion, where reality itself became unstable. In the madness of such a conflict, a Dreadnought could have been swept into a collapsed building as warp energies tore through the fabric of space and time. Maybe the structure that fell on him was so massive, so thoroughly demolished, that the chapter's tech marines searched, but couldn't find him in the aftermath. They would have mourned his loss, recorded his final battle in the chapter's records, and eventually left the system, never knowing that beneath, tons of rubble, the Dreadnought's sarcophagus remained intact, his stasis system still functioning, preserving him in dreamless sleep. Alternatively, consider a battle on a space hulk. These massive agglomerations of ships, wrecked vessels fused together by warp energies and drifting through real space, are death traps of the highest order. A chapter responding to distress signals or seeking to recover valuable artifacts might deploy their Dreadnoughts into the twisted corridors of such a hulk. But space hulks are unstable by nature. Sections collapse without warning. Warp rifts open and close. Gravity fluctuates. In such an environment, a Dreadnought could find himself cut off from his brothers, trapped in a section of the hulk that then separates and drifts away. His battle brothers would search, but the hulk's labyrinthine nature and constant shifting would make recovery impossible. Eventually, they would have to withdraw, leaving him entombed in metal and void, slowly drifting through space. There's also the possibility of deliberate concealment or abandonment during a fighting retreat. If a chapter faced an overwhelming enemy and needed to evacuate quickly, they might be forced to leave behind equipment they couldn't immediately retrieve, including a Dreadnought too damaged to move under its own power. The intention would be to return once the tactical situation allowed, to recover their ancient hero and bear him back to their fortress monastery. But intentions mean little in the face of galactic events. The chapter might be called away to an even more urgent crisis. The system might be declared exterminatus due to corruption or tyrannid infestation. The warp routes to the system could become unstable, making return impossible. Years turn into decades, decades into centuries, and before anyone realizes it, the location of the fallen Dreadnought has been forgotten, lost in the chapter's archives or the mind of a chaplain who died in a subsequent campaign. Yet another scenario involves a crashed ship. Space Marines sometimes use small strike cruisers or rapid strike vessels to deploy their forces. If one of these ships was shot down over an undeveloped or hostile world, its wreckage could scatter across miles of terrain. In the crash, the Dreadnought might have been ejected from the ship, his armored form tumbling into dense jungle or harsh desert. The survivors, if any, might have been forced to evacuate immediately, unable to mount a search for missing equipment. Or perhaps there were no survivors at all, the entire crew killed in the crash, leaving the Dreadnought's location unknown to anyone in the Imperium. Natural disasters present another possibility. Imagine a Dreadnought deployed to a volcanic world, fighting in the shadow of mountains that spew ash and fire. A massive eruption during or after the battle could bury him in layers of volcanic material, meters of stone and cooled lava, sealing him away from the surface. Or a world prone to earthquakes might see a Dreadnought fall into a chasm that opens beneath his feet, swallowing him into darkness hundreds of meters deep. These events might happen after the main battle has concluded, when the chapter has already withdrawn, making recovery impossible. Water worlds offer their own nightmares. A Dreadnought is heavy, immensely so, and while they can theoretically operate in aquatic environments, they're not designed for deep ocean deployment. If one were to fall into a deep body of water during a battle on a naval platform or coastal city, he could sink to depths where even Space Marine equipment would struggle to reach him. The pressure at such depths could actually help preserve the Dreadnought systems, but it would make recovery extraordinarily difficult. After decades or centuries, the exact location would be lost, leaving him resting on the seafloor, waiting in darkness. The key element in all these scenarios is the passage of time. 2007 years. 150 years is an incredibly long period, even by Imperial standards. In that span, entire civilizations rise and fall. Sectors of space change hands between the Imperium, Chaos, and various Xenos races. What was once a heavily populated forge world might become a dead rock after Tyranid invasion. A primitive world might develop into a hive world. A strategically important system might become a forgotten backwater as trade routes shift and priorities change. During this vast stretch of time, the world where our Dreadnought rests has its own history. Let's say, for the sake of our scenario, that it was once an Imperial world, but in the chaos of the Age of Apostasy or some other catastrophic period, it was abandoned. Perhaps the population evacuated due to some environmental catastrophe. Perhaps they were killed by raiders or disease. Perhaps the world was simply deemed not worth the resources to maintain and was left to its own devices. The Imperium, vast as it is, sometimes loses track of worlds, and when it does, those worlds can remain lost for millennia. Now, skip forward those 2,750 years. The world has changed. Maybe vegetation has reclaimed the ruins of Imperial cities. Maybe the harsh environment has eroded structures down to their foundations. Maybe nothing remains visible of human habitation except the most durable materials. Ceramite, adamantium, the stuff dreadnoughts are made of. And then the Orks arrive. Orks can find a world in a variety of ways. Sometimes they're fleeing from defeat, their ramshackle ships limping through space until they find an uninhabited planet to crash on. Sometimes they're following rumors of good scrapping, stories passed between freebooter crews of abandoned Imperial installations, ripe for looting. Sometimes they're just wandering, riding the warp currents, wherever their crude navigation systems and innate psychic abilities take them, looking for something fun to fight, or loot. The reasons don't matter as much as the result. A mob of Orks landing on a world where an ancient dreadnought has been sleeping for thousands of years. The Orks who find our dreadnought probably aren't doing so deliberately. They don't have ancient star charts marking his location. They don't have sophisticated scanning equipment that can detect dormant Imperial technology from orbit. What they have is curiosity, enthusiasm, and a willingness to poke around in literally anything that looks interesting. Maybe they're scavenging through ruins, looking for metal to use in their crude constructions. Maybe they're hunting for something to fight and stumble across what looks like a large piece of scrap. Maybe a mech boy's divining rod, a ridiculous contraption that somehow actually works when an Ork uses it, leads them to a concentration of advanced technology. The initial discovery is probably anticlimactic. To Ork eyes, used to seeing Imperial equipment in battered, broken condition, on battlefields, the Dreadnought doesn't immediately stand out as something special. It's big, sure, and made of good metal, but it's also covered in debris, dirt, rust, and possibly vegetation if it's been lying outdoors. The first Ork to spot it probably just sees a large object that looks like it might be valuable scrap. He calls over his mates, and together they start digging it out, clearing away the accumulated material of centuries or millennia. It's only as they clear more of the Dreadnought that they realize what they've found. The distinctive shape starts to emerge. The broad body, the arm mounts, the suggestion of weapons systems. A mech boy in the group, his genetically programmed instincts screaming that this is something important, pushes his way to the front. He runs his hands over the metal, feeling the quality of the construction, noting details that other Orks wouldn't recognize. This isn't just scrap. This is something built by people who really knew what they were doing This is prime loot. The excitement spreads through the Ork band like wildfire. More Orks arrive, drawn by the commotion. Gretchen are ordered to dig faster, to clear more of the structure. Arguments break out about who has the right to claim this prize. Orks being orks, these arguments might turn into brief fights, establishing a hierarchy of who's strong enough to control this find. But even as they fight among themselves, the digging continues. The Orks are absolutely committed now. They've found something valuable, and they're going to have it. As more of the Dreadnought is revealed, the mech boys get more excited. They can see weapon mounts, power feeds, armor plating thick enough to stop shots that would destroy most vehicles. They can see the sarcophagus, the central armored tomb, though they might not immediately understand what it contains. To them, this looks like the core of some kind of power plant or weapon system. They start planning how to open it, how to access the technology inside, how to figure out what makes this thing work. And that's when things start to get complicated, because the Dreadnought, buried and dormant for thousands of years, is about to experience something that should be impossible. The crude tools of the Orks, hammering and prying at his armor, are going to start triggering systems that have been inactive for longer than some civilizations have existed. Power cells, slowly charged by ambient radiation and their own internal reactions, have built up enough potential to activate emergency systems. Sensors, designed to detect threats to the sarcophagus, begin registering the impacts and vibrations from Ork tools. The machine spirit, if such things truly exist beyond imperial superstition, begins to stir. Inside the sarcophagus, chemical systems start responding to the external stimuli. Stasis begins to break down, not through any controlled process, but because the Dreadnought's automated systems are detecting what they interpret as an attack. Amniotic fluids shift in temperature. Neural interfaces begin to establish connections. And deep in the organic remnants suspended in those fluids, in the brain that has experienced nothing but void for 2,750 years, the first sparks of consciousness begin to fire. The Orks, completely unaware of what they're triggering, continue their work. They're trying to figure out how to open this thing up, how to access the technology inside. Some are suggesting cutting tools. Others want to try prying open seams. A particularly ambitious mech boy is suggesting they hook up a power source and see what happens when they run current through the systems. The debates grow heated, but they're all operating under the assumption that this is just a machine, a valuable but ultimately inanimate piece of technology waiting to be claimed. They don't realize that inside the metal tomb, something is waking up. Something that hasn't experienced consciousness in longer than most Ork clans have existed. Something that's about to transition from absolute nothingness to full sensory input in a matter of moments. Something that's going to be very confused, very disoriented, and in possession of weapons that can level buildings. The ancient stirs, the horror of awakening. Consciousness doesn't return all at once. At first, there's nothing, the same absolute void that has existed for 2,750 years. Then, so gradual as to be almost imperceptible, something changes. Not sensation, not yet. More like the potential for sensation. The abstract awareness that awareness itself might be possible. It's like the moment before waking from deep sleep, when some part of your mind knows that consciousness is approaching but hasn't yet arrived. For the Dreadnought, this transition is catastrophically abrupt in subjective experience, even if the technical process takes several minutes. One moment, there is nothing. No time, no thought, no existence beyond the preserved biological matter floating in amniotic fluids. The next moment, or what feels like the next moment, there is something, a signal, a pulse, a whisper of sensation that shouldn't exist if he's still in stasis. The first thing that returns is pain. Not physical pain. The body that could experience such things is long gone, reduced to the bare minimum necessary to sustain the brain and vital organs. But neural pain, the scream of synapses firing after millennia of silence, connections re-establishing themselves, pathways that have been dormant activating all at once. It's like every nerve in a phantom body suddenly remembering it exists, and the sensation is overwhelming. Then comes sound. The acoustic sensors embedded in the Dreadnought's armor pick up vibrations. The hammering of orc tools against ceramite, the guttural voices arguing in their brutal language, the scrape and crash of debris being cleared away. These sounds are processed by auditory centers that haven't processed anything in thousands of years. The brain doesn't understand them at first. They're just noise, meaningless input, flooding into a consciousness that hasn't had to interpret sensory data since before the age of apostasy. Vision follows, optical sensors coming online in fits and starts. At first, it's just light and dark, patterns without meaning. The image processors, ancient systems that translate sensor data into something the biological brain can comprehend, struggle to initialize. Calibration is off, centuries of minute drift in the targeting systems, meaning that what the sensors see and what the brain interprets don't quite match. The world appears fractured, multiple overlapping images that slowly resolve into something coherent. And what that coherent image shows is nightmarish from the Dreadnought's perspective. Green. Everything is green. Massive, brutish faces peer at his sensors. Tusked mouths move, shouting in a language that his brain doesn't immediately recognize. Crude tools scrape across his armor. The sky, if he can see it, is the wrong color. Or maybe it's not sky at all, but the ceiling of whatever structure or pit he's been buried in. Nothing makes sense. Nothing is familiar. The confusion is total and absolute. The last thing this warrior remembers, the last moment before stasis, might have been the sacred chambers of his chapter's fortress monastery, surrounded by tech marines speaking High Gothic, preparing him for another period of rest. Or it might have been a battlefield, the chaos of combat, the moment before some catastrophic event buried him. But either way, it wasn't this. It wasn't green-skinned aliens hammering on his armor, wasn't strange sounds and unfamiliar sensations, wasn't the complete dislocation of waking in a place and time he doesn't recognize. The Dreadnought tries to access his memory files, the recorded data that should tell him where he is, when he is, what's happening. But the systems are sluggish, degraded by time and lack of maintenance. Information comes through fragmented and corrupted. He can remember being interred, can recall battles from centuries or millennia ago, but the recent past, the events immediately before his burial, are a confusing mess. Did he sleep for a few days? A few years? His internal chronometer, if he thinks to check it, shows a number so large it doesn't immediately compute. 2,750 years. The figure is meaningless, too large to grasp in his current state of confusion. He tries to move, and this is when the true horror of his situation becomes apparent. The motor systems respond, but they're stiff, reluctant. Hydraulic fluids have settled, lubricants have degraded, connections are slow to establish. When he tries to lift an arm, servos whine in protest, moving in jerks and spasms rather than smooth motion. The sensation feedback is wrong, telling him that his limbs are in positions they can't possibly be in, that his body is too heavy or too light, that gravity is pulling in the wrong direction. The Orks, meanwhile, have noticed the movement. The hammering stops. The arguments cease. Every green face turns toward the Dreadnought with a mixture of excitement and wariness. Something just moved. The scrap they've been digging up is alive. This changes everything. For the Dreadnought, the next few seconds are a terrifying blur of sensation. He can hear his own systems coming online, the whir of power plants cycling up from dormancy, the hiss of pressure equalizing, the mechanical clicks and snaps of weapon systems initializing. None of it sounds quite right. Everything has the resonance of machinery that hasn't been used in a very long time. grinding and protesting as it reluctantly returns to operation. His tactical systems try to engage, overlaying his vision with target markers, threat assessments, ammunition counts. But the displays are corrupted, showing impossible numbers, marking targets that aren't there, flagging everything and nothing as threats. The confusion is maddening. He's a warrior bred and trained for battle, augmented beyond human limits, experienced enough to have earned the honor of being preserved in this walking tomb. But right now, in this moment, he's helpless, lost in sensory chaos that he can't pass or understand. The Orks are shouting now. Some are backing away, recognizing that something dangerous is waking up. Others are pressing closer, fascinated by the movement, eager to see what this thing can do. The mech boys are practically vibrating with excitement, their instinctive understanding of technology telling them that they're witnessing something extraordinary. This isn't just scrap. This is a working war machine, and it's activating right in front of them. Inside his armored tomb, the Dreadnought's consciousness is fragmenting. Part of him, the trained warrior, is trying to assess the tactical situation, to understand the threat, to prepare for combat. But that part is being overwhelmed by confusion and panic. Another part, the remnant of the man he used to be, is simply terrified. He's been ripped from nothingness into chaos. He doesn't understand where he is, when he is, or why. The last coherent thought he can remember might be from millennia ago, and now he's surrounded by hostile aliens who are trying to crack him open like a ration tin. His Vox systems activate with a burst of static, and he tries to speak, to call for his brothers, to request status reports, to do anything that might bring some order to this chaos. But what emerges is a distorted mechanical screech, his vocal synthesizers struggling to translate neural impulses into sound after thousands of years of disuse. The Orks jump at the noise, some reaching for weapons, others just staring in amazement. The Dreadnought tries again, forcing his thoughts into the patterns required to activate the Vox system properly. This time, words emerge, though they're heavily distorted, crackling with interference and mechanical artifacts. He speaks in High Gothic, the formal language of the Imperium, asking questions that he desperately needs answered. Where are my brothers? What is my location? Report status. The Orks, of course, don't understand High Gothic. To them, the sounds are just more mechanical noises from this increasingly interesting piece of scrap. They respond in their own language, shouting questions and observations, arguing about what to do next. The mech boys want to keep studying this thing now that it's active. Some of the boys want to fight it, to test themselves against what is obviously a powerful war machine. Others think they should try to capture it intact, to figure out how to make it work for them. For the Dreadnought, the incomprehensible alien speech is another layer of horror. These aren't his brothers. These aren't even humans. The sounds they're making trigger recognition subroutines in his memory. Orks, greenskin Xenos, enemies. The identification brings a moment of clarity through the confusion. He knows what Orks are. He's fought them before, though the memories are fragmented and unclear. This means he's in danger. This means he needs to defend himself. But the weapon systems are still initializing, still running through diagnostic cycles that should take minutes, but are stretching longer because of degraded connections and ancient components struggling to come online. The assault cannon, if he has one, is cycling slowly, ammunition feeds checking and rechecking themselves. The power fist, if equipped, is responding sluggishly to motor commands, its energy field flickering and unstable. He's awake, he's aware, but he's not ready for combat, and the enemies are right there, surrounding him, touching his armor. The machine spirit, that quasi-mystical presence that Imperial doctrine insists inhabits all complex machinery, is also struggling. If such a thing truly exists as more than superstition, then it has also been dormant for millennia, and it's waking to find itself in the hands of Xenos, who have no respect for the proper rituals and prayers. The spirit, if it can be said to have intentions, is angry. It doesn't want to be here. It doesn't want these creatures touching it. It wants to fight, to kill, to purge the Xenos taint from its sacred structure. But the spirit, like the pilot, is constrained by the physical limitations of machinery that hasn't been maintained or serviced in thousands of years. Systems that should respond instantly are sluggish. Power flows that should be smooth and consistent are erratic. The Dreadnought's chassis shudders and jerks as conflicting impulses from both pilot and machine spirit try to assert control over degraded systems. The temporal dislocation is perhaps the worst part. The Dreadnought's sense of time is completely shattered. To him, it feels like he went to sleep moments ago, or perhaps it feels like he's been asleep forever. The chronometer tells him thousands of years have passed, but his subjective experience says otherwise. His memories of his chapter, his brothers, his battles, they all feel immediate and recent. He expects to turn and see familiar faces, to hear familiar voices on the Vox channels. Instead, there are only orcs, only chaos, only the terrible realization that something has gone catastrophically wrong. The psychological impact of this awakening cannot be overstated. Even for a space marine, bred and trained to endure horrors that would break normal humans, this is a trauma of profound magnitude. He's been torn from everything he knew and thrust into an alien present. The galaxy he remembered is gone, replaced by something he doesn't recognize. His brothers are nowhere to be found, quite possibly dead for thousands of years. The Imperium he served, the structures and hierarchies that gave his existence meaning, have changed in ways he can't yet comprehend. And he's surrounded by enemies, by Xenos, who see him not as a revered hero, but as a prize to be looted. His body, such as it remains, is encased in metal, trapped in a prison that is both his salvation and his torment. He can't leave it. He can't even die properly. He's condemned to continue existing, to keep fighting, because that's what dreadnoughts do. They endure when endurance should be impossible. They fight when fighting should be over. They serve beyond death, beyond hope, beyond everything except duty. The Orks continue to crowd around, their initial caution fading as they see the dreadnought struggling to move, clearly disoriented and not immediately attacking. Some of the bolder ones are actually climbing on him now, peering into sensor arrays, poking at joints and servo mounts, trying to figure out how he works. It's an ultimate violation, these crude aliens treating a sacred war machine of the Adeptus Astartes as if it were merely a curiosity to be examined. And through it all, the dreadnought's awareness continues to solidify, to sharpen, to transition from confused awakening to genuine consciousness. The fog is starting to lift. The systems are coming fully online. The weapons are almost ready. And with functional awareness comes rage, cold and terrible and focused. These Xenos have dared to touch him. They've disturbed his rest. They're treating him like salvage. They're about to learn a very painful lesson about what happens when you wake something that was better left sleeping. The reckoning. When the ancient fights back, the transition from confused awakening to combat readiness happens faster than the Orks expect. One moment, the dreadnought is shuddering and jerking, clearly struggling with basic motor functions. The next moment, a weapon system achieves full activation. Maybe it's an assault cannon, the multi-barreled gun mount on the dreadnought's arm cycling to full speed with a rising whine that every veteran of Imperial warfare recognizes as the sound of impending death. Maybe it's a power fist, the massive close combat weapon crackling to life with an energy field that makes the air shimmer and ionize around it. The Orks have just enough time to realize their mistake before the slaughter begins. The assault cannon, if that's what the dreadnought is armed with, opens fire with a roar that drowns out everything else. Heavy shells, stored in the ammunition hopper for thousands of years, but still functional thanks to the robust construction of Imperial munitions, hammer into green flesh at a rate of several hundred rounds per minute. At this range, point blank with Orks literally climbing on the dreadnought, there's no chance to miss, no possibility of survival. The first burst catches an Ork boy who had been trying to pry open a sensor housing. The shells don't just kill him, they essentially disintegrate him, reducing him to scattered pieces of meat and bone. The Orks behind him fare little better as the shells pass through and continue, each round designed to penetrate light armor and soft targets alike. Blood and gore spray across the Dreadnought's chassis and onto the surrounding Orks, who are suddenly scrambling to get away from the killing machine they've so carelessly awakened. Or perhaps the Dreadnought is equipped with a Dreadnought close combat weapon, a massive power fist or chain fist mounted where a right arm would be. These weapons are designed to tear through the armor of enemy vehicles and the hulls of fortifications. Against unarmored or lightly armored infantry, they're absolutely devastating. The Dreadnought swings, the hydraulics in his arm finally responding with something approaching their original smoothness, and the power fist connects with a mech boy who had been leaning in to examine a power coupling. The impact is catastrophic. The energy field disrupts molecular bonds at the point of contact, while the sheer kinetic force of multiple tons of metal swinging with servo-assisted power provides the rest. The mech boy doesn't just die, he explodes, bits of him scattered across a wide radius. The Orks nearest to the impact are caught by shrapnel-like fragments of their former comrade, wounded or killed by the violence of the blow. The ground where the mech boy stood shows a crater from where the power fist struck and continued through. The Dreadnought is screaming now, his vox speakers broadcasting a war cry that might date back thousands of years. A battle cry from an age when his chapter was different, when the enemies were different, when the very nature of the Imperium was different. Or perhaps it's not a war cry at all. Perhaps it's a scream of rage and anguish and betrayal, the sound of a mind that has endured too much finally breaking under the strain. The mechanical voice distorts the words, but the fury behind them is unmistakable. The Orks, credit to them, don't all run. Orks don't flee easily, especially not when something interesting is happening. A substantial number of the boys are raising weapons, shooters and sluggers and whatever else they've cobbled together, and opening fire on the Dreadnought. The bullets and lasfire spark off ceramite armor that was designed to withstand much heavier punishment. Against a functioning Dreadnought in decent repair, these small arms are essentially worthless, nothing more than an annoyance. But this Dreadnought isn't in decent repair. Armor that has been exposed to the elements for thousands of years, that hasn't been blessed with sacred oils or maintained with proper rituals, has degraded. There are weak points, corroded sections, places where the protective coating has worn away. Most of the Ork fire still does nothing, but here and there, rounds find gaps or weakened spots. Warning indicators flash in the Dreadnought's vision, noting minor penetrations, damage to external systems. It's not enough to stop him, not nearly enough, but it's more than the mabon Orks should be able to inflict. The Dreadnought begins to move forward, each step a seismic impact as tons of metal and machinery crash down. The ground, already torn up by Ork excavation, cracks and buckles under his weight. Orks who don't move fast enough are simply crushed underfoot, their bodies disappearing beneath armored feet that were walking battlefields when their great-great-grandfathers were spores. In the Dreadnought's mind, thoughts are racing, trying to make sense of the situation, while simultaneously prosecuting the battle. His tactical systems are identifying targets, marking Orks by type and threat level, calculating firing solutions and movement vectors. But these calculations are happening through a lens of profound confusion and increasing panic. Where is he? When is he? Why are there Orks? Where are his brothers? The questions cycle through his consciousness, even as his weapons continue to fire, creating a strange dissonance between his warrior's discipline and his growing mental distress. Some of the Orks are trying to flank him now, running around to his sides and rear where the armor might be thinner, or the weapons can't easily target. It's not a bad tactic, and if these were just normal Ork boys, it might even work eventually through sheer weight of numbers. But Orks who get around his firing arc discover that a Dreadnought is dangerous from every angle. The power plant in his back is protected by heavy armor plating. His sarcophagus, the armored tomb containing his biological remains, is the most heavily defended part of the entire chassis. And even if they manage to climb on his back, he can turn, can pivot with grinding servos, can smash himself into ruins or the ground to dislodge them. a knob, bigger and meaner than the regular boys, charges forward with a power claw of his own, an orcish imitation of Imperial technology. The two massive close combat weapons meet with a crack like thunder, energy fields disrupting each other, metal screeching against metal. For a moment, they're locked together, the Dreadnought's superior power matched against the Orc knob's raw strength and ferocity. The knob is roaring, actually laughing with the joy of such a good fight. The Dreadnought responds by activating his flamers, if he has them, bathing the knob in promethium that ignites into cleansing fire. The knob screams, not in fear, but in rage, and tries to hold on even as the flames consume him. It's a level of determination and pain tolerance that would be admirable if it weren't so horrifying. But eventually, biology wins out over fighting spirit. The knob collapses, burning, and the Dreadnought steps over his corpse without pause, already targeting the next threat. The battle continues, and the Dreadnought begins to notice patterns, things that his enhanced combat processing identifies as tactically relevant. The Orcs are disorganized, clearly not expecting this fight. They're reacting rather than executing any kind of coordinated strategy. This means they were surprised, which supports the emerging understanding that he wasn't awakened intentionally as part of an enemy attack, but was discovered by accident. This realization should bring some clarity, but instead it deepens the confusion and horror. If the Orcs just found him, that means he was lost. He was forgotten. His chapter left him here, or couldn't recover him, or thought him destroyed. The implications are staggering. How many of his brothers are still alive? Does his chapter even exist anymore? In 2,750 years, entire chapters have been destroyed, lost in the warp, corrupted to chaos. What if he's waking to a galaxy where everything he fought for is gone? But there's no time to process these thoughts, not fully, because the Orcs keep coming. More of them are arriving now, drawn by the sounds of battle, the universal Orc response to hearing gunfire and explosions. They don't know what they're running toward. They just know there's a good scrap happening and they want in on it. This is both the Orcs' greatest strength and their greatest weakness. Their absolute enthusiasm for combat means they never hesitate, never hold back, never stop to develop a better strategy. The Dreadnought's ammunition counter is dropping. However much ammunition was loaded into his hoppers when he was last active, it's not infinite, and he's been firing almost continuously since awakening. This creates a new problem. What happens when the ammunition runs out? Can he retreat? Does he even know where to retreat to? His location systems aren't giving him any useful information. The stars, if he has access to astronomical data, are in the wrong positions, shifted by thousands of years of galactic rotation. The constellations that would tell him where in the galaxy he is have changed beyond recognition. The environmental sensors are painting a picture of a world that isn't in his memory files. Or perhaps it is, but so changed that recognition is impossible. The architecture he can see, the ruins and structures that surround the battle site, aren't in the style he remembers. This could be an alien world. This could be a former Imperial world now abandoned. This could be anything, and he has no way to know. A warning klaxon sounds in the Dreadnought's awareness. Ammunition critical. 5% remaining. Then 3%. Then he's firing the last rounds, watching his external cameras as they tear through Orc flesh, and then the assault cannon clicks empty, the barrels still rotating, but no longer firing. The sudden silence is almost as loud as the gunfire was. The Orcs notice. Of course they notice. The ones who haven't fled, the ones committed to this fight, recognize that the sustained fire has stopped. They start pressing forward again, emboldened by the thought that maybe, just maybe, they can overwhelm this thing if they hit it hard enough, fast enough, all together. The Dreadnought switches tactics. The close combat weapon, power fist or chain fist, becomes the primary tool. He wades into the Orcs, each swing killing or maiming, each step crushing those who fall beneath him. His armor is scored and dented now, lass burns and bullet impacts creating a constellation of damage across his chassis. None of it is critical, not yet, but it's accumulating. And without maintenance, without tech marines to repair and bless and restore, every bit of damage he takes is permanent. The psychological toll is mounting as well. The Dreadnought can feel his grip on reality becoming more tenuous. The stimulation of battle is familiar, comfortable even, but the context is all wrong. He keeps expecting to hear vox traffic, to receive orders from commanders, to coordinate with battle brothers who aren't there and might not even exist anymore. The silence on the command channels is deafening. He tries broadcasting, calling for extraction, for support, for anyone who can hear him. But there's no response, just static, just the empty howl of dead frequencies. In the depths of his consciousness, a terrible thought begins to form. He might be alone, truly, completely alone. The last remnant of something that no longer exists, fighting enemies on a forgotten world for reasons that have long since ceased to matter. The thought is existentially terrifying, in a way that mere combat danger could never be. An Astartes can face death without fear. But facing the death of everything you knew, everyone you served with, the entire context that gave your existence meaning, that's a different kind of terror entirely. The Orks are starting to retreat. Not rooting. Orks don't root easily, but pulling back, reassessing. Too many of their number lie dead or dying. The mech boys, the ones still alive, are realizing that maybe they need a different approach to claim this prize. Maybe they need bigger guns. Maybe they need to trap it rather than fight it directly. Maybe they need to call in the war boss and mount a proper assault with proper numbers. The Dreadnought stands amidst the carnage, his optical sensors tracking the withdrawing Orks, his tactical systems marking them as they pull back beyond immediate weapons range. His ammunition is expended. His power reserves are dropping. Maintaining the energy field on the close combat weapon drains power faster than the ancient reactor can replenish it. His armor is damaged. His systems are showing multiple warnings and errors, and he has absolutely no idea what to do next. In the sudden quiet after the battle, with only the crackling of flames and the moans of wounded Orks to break the silence, the Dreadnought has time to truly confront his situation. He's awake. He's functional, at least mostly, but he's completely, utterly lost in a time and place he doesn't recognize, surrounded by enemies, with no allies in sight and no clear path to safety. The horror of it settles over him like a shroud. This isn't the glorious awakening to fight for the Emperor one more time. This is a nightmare, a cruel joke played by fate. He's been preserved through the centuries only to wake in the worst possible circumstances, alone and forgotten on a world that might not even have a name anymore. Ork innovation, the mech boy's perspective. While the Dreadnought stands amidst the carnage, grappling with existential horror, the surviving Orks are having a very different experience. They're excited. No, more than excited. They're absolutely thrilled. This is the best thing that's happened to this particular mob in years, maybe ever. They found a piece of tech that's not just valuable, it's alive and incredibly dangerous. To an Ork, this is like finding buried treasure and a challenging opponent all in one package. The mech boys, in particular, are experiencing something close to euphoria. Their genetically programmed instincts are screaming at them that what they've uncovered is special, important, valuable beyond measure. This isn't just any looted vehicle. This is something ancient, something sophisticated, something that could teach them new tricks and new ways to build things. The fact that it just killed a couple dozen of their fellow Orks is, from the mech boy perspective, just proof of how good it is. Gronkak Iron Teeth, let's call him, a big mech with a reputation for being particularly clever when it comes to understanding captured Imperial technology, is already formulating plans. He watched the battle from a safe distance, saw how the walking metal tomb fought, noted its weapons, its movements, its strengths, and more importantly, he noted its weaknesses. The way it struggled to move at first, the degradation visible in its armor, the fact that its weapons ran out of ammunition. This thing is powerful, yes, but it's also old, poorly maintained, and quite possibly falling apart. To Gronkak, this presents an opportunity. If they can capture this thing intact, if they can figure out how it works, if they can study the technology inside, the applications are limitless. The power plant alone would be worth the effort. Imperial power systems are generally more efficient than Ork ones, and a Dreadnought's reactor is built to run for centuries without refueling. Imagine what a mech boy could do with that kind of reliable power source. Then there are the weapons systems. Even empty of ammunition, the assault cannon represents a weapon design that could be studied and replicated. The targeting systems, if they can be extracted and understood, might be superior to what Orks typically use. The armor formula, the way the ceramite is treated and layered, that's valuable knowledge. And the close combat weapons, especially power fists, those are prime candidates for looting and mounting on other vehicles or on Meganob's armor. But perhaps most intriguingly, there's the pilot. Gronkak doesn't fully understand what he saw in those brief glimpses of the Dreadnought's interior systems. But he understands enough to know that there's something biological inside the machine, something that's connected to it, controlling it. This fascinates him. Ork technology is crude and direct. You build a vehicle, you drive it. You build a gun, you shoot it. But this is something different. This is a living being somehow merged with a machine, able to control it through thought and will. If Gronkak could figure out how that works, the applications boggle even his relatively simple mind. Could they do the same with Ork pilots? Could they create deaf dreads that respond even faster, that move with even more precision? Could they take captured humans, or even other Orks, and wire them into vehicles, creating a whole new category of looted equipment? The other mech boys are thinking along similar lines, though none quite as sophisticated as Gronkak. They're arguing about the best way to proceed. Some want to try to capture the Dreadnought by force, overwhelming it with numbers and heavy weapons until it can't fight anymore. Others suggest trying to trap it, to lure it into a pit or cage where it can be safely studied. A few are suggesting they try to communicate with it, though what they'd say or how they'd say it is unclear. Gronkak has a different idea. He noticed how the Dreadnought responded to being attacked, how it fought without hesitation or mercy. That suggests a combative nature, which is something Orks understand and respect. But he also noticed the confusion in its movements, the way it called out on Vox channels that got no response. This thing is lost, disoriented, maybe even frightened, if such advanced technology can feel fear. And lost, scared things can sometimes be manipulated if you're clever about it. His plan forms quickly. They need to make the Dreadnought need them. Right now it's self-sufficient, or at least it thinks it is. It has weapons, armor, and the will to fight. But what it doesn't have is ammunition, maintenance, or information. If the Orks can position themselves as the solution to these needs, they might be able to gain the Dreadnought's cooperation, or at least get close enough to study it properly. The plan has risks, obviously. The thing could decide to kill them all despite being out of ammunition. Close combat is still an option for it, as the dozen or so dead Orks can attest. But Gronkak is willing to take that risk for the potential payoff. This is the kind of prize that could make him famous among mech boys. This is the kind of discovery that legends are built on. He starts organizing the surviving Orks. They need to establish a perimeter to make sure the Dreadnought doesn't wander off while they're preparing. They need to send word to the war boss, because a find this significant requires his approval and support. They need to gather materials, chains and cables strong enough to potentially restrain the walking tomb, heavy weapons as insurance in case it attacks again, welding equipment and cutting, tools for when they finally crack it open. But most importantly, they need patience, which is not an Ork virtue. They need to watch, to learn, to understand how this thing behaves before they make their next move. Gronkak is smart enough to recognize that rushing in again will just result in more dead Orks, and possibly a lost prize if the Dreadnought escapes or is destroyed. The war boss, when he arrives several hours later with a mob of his best warriors and several deaf dreads for good measure, is initially skeptical. He's heard the reports about a big metal thing that killed a bunch of boys, but orcs tell stories that grow in the telling. By the time word reached him, the Dreadnought had supposedly grown to the size of a stomper and had single-handedly destroyed 100 orcs. The reality, while still impressive, is somewhat less dramatic. "So this is what all the fuss is about," the war boss rumbles, his power claw crackling with barely contained energy. "Don't look so tough standing. They're not moving." "Boss," Gronkak says carefully, knowing that war bosses can be quick to anger when they feel their time has been wasted. "This ain't just any scrap. This is something special. Humi tech from way back when. Still working. Still dangerous. We crack it open. We learn how it works. We can make our own versions. Better def dreads. Faster killer cans. Weapons that don't jam as much." The war boss considers this. He's not stupid as far as orcs go. He got to be war boss by being bigger and meaner than everyone else, yes, but also by being cunning enough to know when to fight and when to think. The idea of better tech, especially better close combat tech, appeals to him. And the idea of looting something this valuable from the Humies, well, that's just good business. "All right," he decides. "We takes it, but we does it smart-like. No more rushing in and getting crumped. We surrounds it. We waits for it to run out of power or make a mistake. Then we jumps it all at once. And Gronkak, you make sure we don't break it too bad. I wants it still working when we figure out how to make it shoot for us instead of at us." The plan is set. The orcs begin establishing a siege, if you can call it that. They position themselves around the Dreadnought, at what they hope is a safe distance. Heavy weapons are brought up, rockets, big shooters, even a looted lascannon that probably doesn't work half the time, but might be useful if it does. Deaf dreads take position, ready to engage if the Humi Dreadnought makes any aggressive moves. Trucks and buggies circle the perimeter, ready to chase if it tries to run. Gronkak sets up his workshop right there on the battlefield. He's studying the Dreadnought through binoculars, making notes in his own crude way, sketching designs of what he can see. He's documenting the armor configuration, the weapon mounts, the way the legs are articulated. Every detail might be important later when they finally crack this thing open and start learning its secrets. Some of the younger mech boys are asking if they can try to make contact. Maybe if they offer to fix it, to provide ammunition, to help it, it might cooperate. Gronkak thinks this is incredibly naive, but not entirely wrong. The Dreadnought is clearly low on resources. If they could somehow communicate that they have what it needs, that might open negotiation possibilities. The problem, of course, is language. Orcs speak their own brutal tongue, a language that's more shouts and threats than complex communication. They don't speak Gothic, high or low, and they certainly don't speak the ancient Astartes battle cant that the Dreadnought might be using. Any attempt at communication would be essentially pantomime, and trying to pantomime, "We want to help you so we can study your technology," seems likely to be misinterpreted as, "We want to attack you again." Still, Gronkak authorizes the attempt. He has a grot, the smallest and most expendable member of the warband, approach slowly, with its hands up in what it hopes is a non-threatening gesture. The grot is carrying a belt of ammunition, appropriate caliber for the assault cannon, looted from a previous battle against Imperial Guard. The idea is to show that they have something the Dreadnought needs. From inside his armored tomb, the Dreadnought watches this approach with deep suspicion. His tactical systems mark the Gretchen as a minimal threat, barely worth targeting. But the presence of the ammunition is puzzling. Is this a trap? Are the Xenos trying to lure him into complacency before attacking again? Or is there some other motive he's not seeing? The Gretchen gets within 20 meters before the Dreadnought's Vox speakers activate with a harsh burst of static. "Halt! Identify!" The words are in High Gothic, meaningless to the grot, but the tone is universal. The little creature freezes, trembling. "No hurt!" the grot squeaks in broken Low Gothic, one of the few words it knows. "We help! We help!" It holds, up the ammunition belt, gesturing at it, then at the Dreadnought. trying to convey the idea of offering a gift. The Dreadnought processes this. Help? The Xenos are offering help. This makes no sense from any tactical perspective he understands. Orks don't help enemies. They kill them or loot them. This must be a deception, a ploy to get him to lower his guard. But the ammunition is real. He can see it through his optical sensors, can identify the caliber, can verify that it's compatible with his weapon systems. The dilemma paralyzes him for a moment. Does he accept the offering, risking a trap? Does he reject it, maintaining his defensive posture, but remaining critically low on resources? Or does he attack, eliminating the immediate threat, but expending energy he can't easily replenish? The standoff continues, Gretchen and Dreadnought staring at each other across 20 meters of torn ground, while mech boys watch from their positions and the ancient warrior tries to decide if accepting help from Xenos is a greater heresy than dying alone on a forgotten world. Lost in time. The psychological nightmare. While the physical standoff continues, the true horror for the Dreadnought isn't the tactical situation. It's not the Orks surrounding him, or the damaged systems, or the low ammunition. It's the crushing weight of temporal dislocation. The psychological nightmare of existing 2,750 years out of sync with everything you know and understand. Inside his sarcophagus, in what's left of his biological mind, the Marine who was is grappling with a reality that breaks every reference point he has. Time, that most fundamental of human experiences, has betrayed him. From his perspective, he closed his eyes a moment ago. Stasis doesn't allow for the passage of time as we understand it. There's no dreaming, no awareness, no sense that anything is happening. So when consciousness returns, it's as if no time has passed at all. Except the chronometer says otherwise. 2,750 years. The number is there, displayed in his vision, impossible to ignore or deny. But his mind rebels against accepting it. That can't be right. It must be a malfunction, a glitch in the systems. Numbers that large don't represent time that actually passed. They can't. But the evidence surrounds him. The degradation of his systems, the fact that his chapter isn't here, the presence of Orks on what was presumably once an imperial world. The stars themselves, if his astronomical systems can see them, are in positions that only make sense if millennia have truly elapsed. The galaxy has rotated, stars have moved, entire constellations have shifted. The physical evidence is undeniable. The Marine tries to remember what happened before the sleep. Fragments come back, disconnected and unreliable. There was a battle. He remembers that much. There were enemies, heavy casualties. The desperate defense of something important. Was it a fortress monastery? A shrine world? A strategic position? The details are fuzzy, corrupted by the passage of time and the degradation of organic memory. He tries to remember his brothers, the faces of those he served with, but the faces are blurred, indistinct. He knows he had brothers. He knows he fought alongside them. But their names, their personalities, the specific memories that would make them real people rather than abstract concepts, these are gone. Dissolved in the millennia of dreamless sleep, lost to the slow degradation of neurons that were never meant to be preserved this long. This is a horror specific to those who survive long past their time. Not just living longer than you should, but existing across such a vast gulf of years that you become disconnected from everything that made you who you were. The philosopher's ship paradox made terrifyingly real. If every memory is replaced, if every reference point is lost, if every person you knew is dead, are you still the same person who went to sleep? Or is the current consciousness something else, something new, wearing the name and armor of someone who died thousands of years ago? The Space Marine identity is built on brotherhood, on chapter culture, on shared history and collective purpose. A Marine knows who he is because he knows where he came from, who trained him, who serves beside him. He knows his chapter's history, its heroes, its traditions. These things provide context, meaning, identity. But what happens when all of that is gone? When the brothers are dust? When the traditions have evolved beyond recognition? When the chapter might not even exist anymore in any form he would recognize? The Dreadnought tries to access his mission memory, the core directives that should tell him what he's supposed to be doing. But the data is corrupted, incomplete. He remembers fragments of oaths taken, promises made, duties assigned. But without context, without knowing what galaxy he's waking to, these remembered duties are meaningless. Is the fortress monastery he swore to defend even standing? Is the war master he pledged to follow even alive? The questions multiply faster than answers emerge. There's a term for this in human psychology, though it's rarely applied to space marines: temporal trauma. The disconnect between subjective experience and objective time, creating a fundamental break in cognitive continuity. Humans who experience minor versions of this, waking from comas after months or years, often struggle to reintegrate with reality. They know intellectually that time has passed, but emotionally, experientially, they're still in the moment before their awareness ended. Now multiply that by thousands. Multiply it by the enhanced complexity of a space marine's mind, the additional processing power and memory capacity that comes with the Geneseed modifications. The trauma doesn't scale linearly. It compounds, fractals, becomes something approaching cosmic horror. To know that, you've slept through the rise and fall of civilizations, through wars that killed trillions, through changes so profound that the very nature of the Imperium might have shifted, and then there's the knowledge that this is what his existence will be, forever, or until something finally destroys him completely. Because Dreadnoughts don't retire. They don't get to say, "Enough, I've served my time, let me rest." They serve until the sarcophagus is breached, until the biological components finally fail beyond even the sophisticated life support's ability to sustain them. Some Dreadnoughts have served for 10,000 years, have memories stretching back to the Horus heresy itself. The thought of enduring that long, of waking periodically across such vast spans of time, of constantly experiencing this same temporal dislocation over and over, is maddening. The Dreadnought's tactical systems flash a warning. The Gretchen is still there, still holding out the ammunition. A decision needs to be made. But how can he decide anything when he doesn't even know if he's sane? How can he trust his judgment when his entire perception of reality has been shattered? The normal decision-making frameworks, the training and instinct that would guide a space marine in combat, all of that assumes a shared understanding of context, of objectives, of what's at stake. None of that applies here. In the absence of external guidance, he falls back on the most fundamental programming: survival. Not his own, necessarily. Individual survival has never been the primary concern for a space marine, but the survival of the knowledge he carries, the genetic material, if any remains viable, the tactical data stored in his memory banks. All of that is potentially valuable to the Imperium, assuming the Imperium still exists in a form he would recognize. The Vox channels are still silent. He's tried every frequency he knows, broadcast identification codes from his chapter, called for extraction on emergency, bans. Nothing. Either there's no one in range to hear, or the Imperium has changed its communication protocol so radically that his attempts aren't even registering as coherent signals. Both possibilities are equally disturbing. There's also the possibility, too terrible to fully contemplate, that his chapter is gone, destroyed, corrupted, or simply lost in the millennia he's been asleep. Chapters have fallen. The astral claws became the Red Corsairs. The Thousand Suns turned to chaos. Even loyalist chapters have been destroyed by overwhelming enemies or by imperial decree after some transgression, real or imagined. In 2,750 years, anything could have happened. If his chapter is gone, what does that make him? The last representative of a dead legacy, a ghost from a time no one remembers. The horror of that possibility is almost worse than the temporal dislocation. At least if his chapter still exists, he has a place to return to, even if everything else has changed. But if they're gone, he's truly alone. The last ember of a fire that's been extinguished for millennia. The psychological stress is manifesting in his systems. Diagnostics show irregular neural patterns, synapses firing in sequences that don't match normal parameters. The machine spirit, if it's truly separate from his consciousness, seems agitated as well, sending error codes and warnings that don't correspond to any actual mechanical problem. It's as if the Dreadnought itself is experiencing distress at the situation it finds itself in. Some of the more esoteric Imperial scholars theorize that Dreadnoughts develop a kind of Gestalt consciousness, a blend of the pilot's mind and the machine spirit, creating something that's neither fully organic nor fully mechanical, but some synthesis of both. If that's true, then what the Dreadnought is experiencing isn't just one mind in crisis, but two consciousnesses trying to reconcile an impossible situation, feeding each other's distress in a negative feedback loop. The Marine forces himself to focus. He's trained for this. Maybe not for this exact scenario, but for operating under conditions of extreme stress and uncertainty. Space Marines are conditioned to function when everything is chaos, when the fog of war obscures all clarity, when the only option is to keep fighting until you find a way through or die trying. So, assess the situation objectively. Facts only, no speculation. Fact, he's awake. Fact, he's on an unknown world. Fact, he's surrounded by Orks. Fact, his ammunition is depleted. Fact, his chapter hasn't responded to Vox hails. Fact, the chronometer indicates extreme time displacement. Fact, there's a Gretchen offering ammunition. The last fact brings him back to the immediate problem. The Gretchen is still there, has been standing there for several minutes now while the Dreadnought wrestles with existential horror. The little creature is getting nervous, shifting from foot to foot, clearly aware that it's in a very dangerous position. A decision crystallizes. The Dreadnought doesn't have enough information to make optimal choices about his long-term future. But he can make tactical decisions about the immediate present, and tactically, accepting the ammunition makes sense. It restores capability, gives him options. If it's a trap, he'll deal with that when it springs. If it's genuine, even for incomprehensible Xenos reasons, he benefits. Approach slowly, he broadcasts in Gothic, knowing the Grot probably can't understand, but trying anyway. Place the ammunition on the ground and withdraw. The Gretchen, responding to tone if not words, shuffles forward cautiously. It places the ammunition belt on the churned ground, then scurries backward as fast as its little legs can carry it. The Dreadnought waits, sensors scanning for any sign of deception, traps, or attacks. When none manifests, he moves forward carefully, each step sending vibrations through the ground. His manipulator arm, the one that doesn't mount a weapon, reaches down and grasps the ammunition belt. The servos whine slightly as they lift it, the weight negligible to machinery designed to tear apart vehicles. He feeds it into the assault cannon's ammunition hopper, watching as the system registers the new supply, updating the ammunition count from critical to modest. It's a small victory, but victories matter when everything else is uncertainty and horror. He has ammunition again. He has options. And perhaps most importantly, he's demonstrated to the Orks that he can be reasoned with after a fashion. This might lead to more opportunities, or it might lead to more complicated problems. Time will tell. Time. There's that concept again, mocking him with its vastness, its incomprehensible weight. But at least for the moment, he has a small measure of control. The ammunition is loaded, the weapon is ready, and whatever comes next, whether it's combat or negotiation or something he can't even predict, he'll face it as a warrior of the Adeptus Astartes, even if the Adeptus Astartes he knew no longer exists. Historical precedents. When worlds collide. While this specific scenario of a Dreadnought lost for nearly 3 millennia being discovered by Orks, is unique in its details. The broader pattern of ancient Imperial technology falling into Xenos hands is distressingly common in the history of the galaxy. The archives of the Adeptus Mechanicus, such as they are, contain numerous accounts of lost war gear, vehicles, and even titans being recovered by enemies, studied, and sometimes turned against the Imperium itself. The most famous case might be Bjorn the Fell-Handed, the oldest living dreadnought in the Imperium. He's been interred for over 10,000 years, has memories that stretch back to the days when the Emperor walked among men and the Primarchs led their legions. But even Bjorn, revered as he is, has never been lost and recovered. He's been continuously maintained, awakened regularly for his wisdom, protected by the Space Wolves with fanatical dedication. The scenario of a dreadnought being lost for thousands of years and then found by enemies simply hasn't happened to anyone as ancient as Bjorn, which speaks to how catastrophic such a loss would be. But there are lesser-known cases that provide some context. Brother Ancient Tancred of the Black Templars is documented as having been lost during a campaign against Ork forces, buried beneath the rubble of a collapsed cathedral during the purge of a greenskin infestation. His brothers believed him destroyed, his sarcophagus crushed beyond recovery. But when Imperial forces returned to the world 2 centuries later to establish a new settlement, they discovered him still functional, his systems degraded but operational, having sustained himself on emergency power for 200 years. When they finally excavated him and reactivated him from emergency stasis, Tancred's first words were, reportedly a continuation of the battle cry he'd been shouting when the cathedral collapsed. He had no awareness that any time had passed, no understanding that everyone he'd been fighting alongside was long dead. The psychological trauma of this revelation was said to have deepened his already fierce devotion to the Emperor, but also made him more withdrawn and melancholic. The Black Templars' chaplains worked with him for decades, helping him process the temporal dislocation, but those who knew him said he was never quite the same after that experience. Tancred's case was only 2 centuries, a fraction of the time we're discussing. But even that relatively brief period was enough to cause profound psychological impact. Multiplying that by more than 10 suggests that whatever consciousness emerges from our ancient dreadnought will be fundamentally different from what went into stasis, shaped by trauma that few beings in the galaxy have ever experienced. There are also documented cases of dreadnoughts being captured by chaos forces and corrupted. The process is neither quick nor simple. Dreadnoughts are heavily warded against chaos influence, their sarcophagi inscribed with prayers and purity seals, their machine spirits bound by sacred oaths. But given enough time, enough exposure to warp energies, enough whispering from demonic entities, even a dreadnought can fall. The fate of these fallen dreadnoughts varies. Some become hellbrutes, twisted parodies of their former selves, their pilots driven mad by millennia of sensory deprivation, broken only by brief, violent moments of combat. Others become demon engines, their consciousnesses subsumed entirely by warp entities. A few, the most tragic cases, retain enough of their original personality to know what they've become, to remember their oaths and their chapter, even as they serve the dark gods against their will. The Imperium's response to the possibility of a dreadnought being captured or corrupted is unambiguous. It must be destroyed, preferably with the entire sarcophagus intact, so that the honored dead can be recovered and given proper rites. The knowledge that a dreadnought contains, the tactical data and chapter secrets locked in its memory banks, cannot be allowed to fall into enemy hands. Better to lose everything than risk such information being used against the Imperium. Orks, however, present a different problem than chaos. Where chaos would seek to corrupt and turn the dreadnought against its former allies, Orks would simply want to loot it. They lack the subtlety for corruption, the patience for indoctrination. Their approach is more direct. Tear it apart, study the pieces, figure out how to make their own versions, or how to repurpose the components for other projects. there are scattered reports in Imperial records of Ork technology incorporating looted Imperial systems. Def dreads with suspiciously sophisticated targeting systems. Stompas with power plants that seem too efficient for Ork construction. Weapons that fire with accuracy no Ork-built gun should achieve. These are often dismissed by Imperial observers as either exaggeration or as evidence of the Orks' latent psychic abilities, making poor technology function better than it should. But some inquisitors and tech priests who specialize in Xenos threats believe that Orks, particularly mech boys, are more technologically sophisticated than the Imperium gives them credit for. The crude appearance of Ork technology is deceptive. Beneath the rust and random welding, there's often sound engineering, sometimes incorporating principles that the Mechanicus has forgotten or never understood. When Orks get their hands on truly advanced Imperial technology, they can occasionally figure out not just how to use it, but how to replicate the underlying principles in their own constructions. This makes the scenario of Orks capturing our ancient Dreadnought particularly dangerous from an Imperial perspective. If they succeed in cracking it open without destroying the internal systems, if mechboys like Gronkak can study the technology and understand it, the implications are staggering. Ork Def Dreads are already terrifying. Imagine Def Dreads built with insights gained from dissecting a Space Marine Dreadnought, incorporating Imperial power systems, targeting computers, and armor configurations. The Death Watch, the chamber militant of the Ordo Xenos, has protocols for exactly this kind of situation. If a Dreadnought is confirmed lost behind enemy lines with no possibility of recovery, the priority becomes ensuring its destruction rather than retrieval. This is done through a variety of means. Orbital bombardment if possible. Assassination teams sent to trigger the Dreadnought's self-destruct mechanisms, or in extreme cases, exterminatus of the entire world to prevent the technology from being studied. But these protocols assume the Imperium knows where the Dreadnought is and what's happening to it. In our scenario, there's no Imperial presence, no one calling for help or reporting the situation. The Dreadnought is alone, unaccounted for, probably presumed destroyed by whatever chapter he once belonged to. Even if he wanted to call for help, he can't. The Vox channels are silent. The Imperium might not even monitor the frequencies he's using anymore. And even if they did, would anyone respond to a call from a Dreadnought claiming to be from a chapter that might have been destroyed thousands of years ago? There's also the question of chapter pride and shame. Some chapters are so protective of their image, so concerned with maintaining their honor, that they would go to extraordinary lengths to recover or destroy a lost Dreadnought rather than admit they'd lost one in the first place. The Sons of Medusa, for instance, are known for their meticulous record-keeping and their obsessive protection of their technology. A lost Dreadnought would be considered such a shameful failure that they would dedicate considerable resources to either recovering or destroying it, regardless of the time elapsed. Other chapters might take a more pragmatic approach. The Ultramarines, for all their adherence to the Codex Astartes, are also known for their practical assessment of situations. If a Dreadnought was lost thousands of years ago, they might conduct the appropriate mourning rituals, record the loss in their archives, and move on. Attempting to recover a relic that's been missing for millennia, especially if it means diverting resources from current threats, might be seen as poor prioritization. But there's another dimension to consider. What happens if word of this discovery spreads beyond just the Ork warband that found the Dreadnought? The galaxy in the 41st millennium is interconnected in strange ways. Ork freebooter crews travel between systems, trade with other Ork clans, spread stories of their adventures. If Gronkak succeeds in his study of the Dreadnought, if he starts building improved technology based on what he learns, other Orks will notice. They'll want to know where he got his new ideas. The story will spread, and eventually such stories reach Imperial ears. Inquisitors monitoring Xenos activity might hear reports of Orks with unusually sophisticated technology in a particular sector. Rogue traders passing through Ork-controlled space might see Def Dreads that look suspiciously like they incorporate Imperial design elements. Deathwatch kill teams deployed to combat greenskin threats might recover pieces of technology that match records of equipment lost centuries or millennia ago. Once the Imperium becomes aware that a dreadnought might have fallen into Ork hands, the response would be swift and overwhelming. Not just because of the strategic danger, though that's significant, but because of the symbolic importance. A dreadnought represents the Imperium's power, its ability to preserve its heroes beyond death, its technological superiority over the Xenos filth. To have that turned into Ork scrap, studied and looted and incorporated into crude greenskin technology, is an insult that demands redress. A crusade might be called. Not a full galactic crusade, but a focused military effort to cleanse the sector, destroy the Ork presence, and recover whatever remains of the lost dreadnought. Multiple chapters might contribute forces, seeing it as a matter of collective honor that such a relic be properly recovered, or, failing that, completely destroyed, so that no trace of it remains in Xenos hands. The irony is that all of this, the military mobilization, the expenditure of resources, the deaths of thousands or millions in the campaign, all of it would be to either save or destroy a single consciousness that's already been lost for thousands of years. A warrior who probably doesn't even recognize the Imperium he's waking to, whose chapter might not exist anymore, whose knowledge is likely obsolete, whose very identity might be so eroded by time that he's essentially become a different being entirely. But the Imperium doesn't work on pragmatic calculations of cost and benefit. It works on faith, on tradition, on the symbolic importance of what things represent, rather than what they practically accomplish. A dreadnought isn't just a weapon, or even just a repository of knowledge. It's a sacred relic, a link to the past, a physical embodiment of the Imperium's eternal nature. That such a thing could be lost, could fall into enemy hands, could be desecrated by Xenos, that's unacceptable at a fundamental level that transcends tactical considerations. So whether the dreadnought survives his encounter with the Orks or not, whether he escapes or is captured or is destroyed, the ripples from this event will spread. Stories will be told. Reports will be filed. Somewhere, somehow, the Imperium will learn that one of its ancient warriors was lost and found again after thousands of years. And, when that happens, the full weight of Imperial bureaucracy, faith, and military might will focus on resolving the situation in the only way the Imperium knows how, with overwhelming force and absolute conviction. Potential outcomes, futures, branching from the present. The standoff between the ancient dreadnought and the Ork warband can resolve in several different ways, each with profound implications. The future is not fixed, not even in a universe as grim and dark as the 41st Millennium. Let's explore the most likely scenarios, understanding that reality might blend elements of several, or produce outcomes we haven't even imagined. Scenario 1. The warrior's escape. In this outcome, the dreadnought manages to break through the Ork encirclement and escape into the wilderness of the unknown world. This would require a combination of factors working in his favor. Perhaps nightfall provides cover, or a geographic feature like a canyon or dense forest that the dreadnought can exploit while limiting the Ork's ability to surround him. Maybe the war boss makes a tactical error, pulling too many warriors away from one section of the perimeter, creating a gap. The escape wouldn't be clean or easy. The dreadnought would take more damage, expend more ammunition and power. Ork rockets and looted weapons would score hits, potentially crippling some of his systems. But space marine technology, even ancient and degraded, is built to take punishment. If he can break contact with the main Ork force, if he can get enough distance that they lose track of him, survival becomes possible. But survival to what end? He's still on an unknown world with no idea of where he is or how to get home, assuming home even exists anymore. He would need to find shelter, someplace defensible where he could go into emergency stasis and conserve power. Perhaps a cave system, deep enough that Ork sensors couldn't detect him, stable enough that it wouldn't collapse and bury him again. In stasis, his power, Reserves could last for decades, even centuries, slowly recharging from ambient radiation. He would sleep, dreamlessly, while the world spun on without him. The Orks might search for a while, but Ork attention spans are limited. Eventually they'd give up, distracted by new conflicts or new loot to pursue. The Dreadnought would become a legend to them, a story told around fires. The Hume metal god that woke up and escaped, dangerous and mysterious. And then what? Eventually, perhaps, the world might be rediscovered by the Imperium, a rogue trader's vessel, an explorator fleet, even another Ork, Wag, that attracts Imperial attention. When Imperial forces arrive, when they scan the world and detect dormant power signatures that match ancient Dreadnought patterns, they would investigate. Teams would be sent. The sarcophagus would be recovered. The Dreadnought would wake to find himself among his own kind again, or at least among humans. But the adjustment would be no easier than the initial awakening. The humans who found him would be different. Their technology evolved or devolved depending on how the millennia treated them. Their dialects of Gothic might be almost unrecognizable. Their customs and protocols might seem alien to a warrior from a different age. The Mechanicus would want to study him, to extract every bit of data from his memory banks. Chaplains would want to examine his faith, to ensure he hasn't been corrupted by his ordeal. His own chapter, if it still exists, would want to reclaim him, but would they recognize who he is? Would they accept a Dreadnought who's been lost for so long, who might have been exposed to Xenos, who cannot verify his identity through any means they would normally trust? This scenario offers hope of a sort. The Dreadnought survives, potentially returns to Imperial service, but it's a complicated, difficult hope, shadowed by all the trauma and dislocation he's already endured. Scenario 2. Fighting to the last. Perhaps the Dreadnought decides that escape is impossible or dishonorable. Perhaps his fragmented memories of duty convince him that he should stand and fight, that a warrior of the Adeptus Astartes doesn't flee from Xenos filth. Or perhaps the Orks press their attack before he can organize an escape, giving him no choice but to sell his existence dearly. This battle would be apocalyptic in its own small way. The Dreadnought, knowing he's fighting his last fight, would hold nothing back. Every round of ammunition, every joule of power, every mechanical advantage his ancient frame possesses would be employed with maximum efficiency. He would target the mech boys first, eliminating the greatest threat to Imperial technology. Then the warboss and knobs, removing leadership. Then simple maximum killing, taking as many Orks with him as possible. The Orks would fight with their characteristic enthusiasm, delighted to have such a challenging opponent. Def Dreads would close in, power claws against ancient. Ceramite. Rockets would fly, detonating against armor that's held for thousands of years, but cannot hold forever. The ground would become a charnel house, green bodies and mechanical debris scattered across churned earth. And in the end, inevitably, the Dreadnought would fall. Perhaps the sarcophagus would be breached by concentrated fire. Perhaps the power plant would be damaged beyond the machine's ability to compensate. Perhaps he would simply run out of ammunition and power simultaneously, leaving him immobilized and helpless as the Orks close in. The moment of death, when it comes, might actually be a mercy. After 2,750 years of preserved existence, after the horror of waking to confusion and isolation, after the battle and the fear and the grinding weight of temporal dislocation, final dissolution might feel like relief. The consciousness that has endured so long, that has been pushed far beyond its natural span, might welcome the darkness that cannot be escaped this time. The Orks would loot the wreckage, of course. They would take everything useful, the weapons, the armor plating, the power plant if it's still intact. Gronkak would try to recover whatever he can from the sarcophagus, though the biological components would likely be destroyed in the violence of the final battle. He might get some insights from the mechanical systems, some improvements to incorporate into future Def Dreads. But the knowledge, the memories, the link to a time long past, all of that would be lost forever. This scenario is tragic, but clean. A warrior's death fighting against hopeless odds, taking enemies with him until the very end. There are worse fates in the 41st millennium than dying in battle, and for a space marine, it might be considered the preferred outcome. Better to fall in combat than to suffer capture, corruption, or the slow erosion of identity that comes with enduring too long. Scenario 3. Uneasy alliance. Perhaps the most unexpected outcome would be some form of cooperation between the Dreadnought and the Orks. Not friendship, certainly. Not trust. But a transactional relationship based on mutual benefit. The Dreadnought needs resources, ammunition, power, information about where he is and how to find Imperial forces. The Orks, particularly Gronkak, want access to the technology and knowledge the Dreadnought represents. A deal could be struck, brokered through the crude communication possible between them. The Dreadnought provides information, allows limited examination of his non-critical systems, perhaps even assists in certain technical projects. In exchange, the Orks provide resources, maintenance, and eventually, transportation off-world on one of their ramshackle ships. This scenario requires the Dreadnought to compromise his principles in ways that would be unthinkable under normal circumstances. Working with Xenos is heresy of the highest order. Allowing Orks to study Imperial technology is a betrayal of the Mechanicus and potentially the Imperium itself. But what does heresy mean to a consciousness that has been lost for thousands of years, that cannot confirm whether the Imperium it knew still exists, that has no one to answer to except the degraded remnants of its own moral code? The psychological rationalization might go something like this. The priority is to return to Imperial space, to report back, to deliver whatever intelligence he possesses to those who can use it. To do that, he needs to survive, which means he needs resources. If the only source of those resources is Xenos, then expedient cooperation becomes acceptable. It's not ideal. It's not what the Codex Astartes would recommend, but the Codex assumes you have options. Here, there are none. Gronkak would be thrilled with this arrangement. Direct access to a functioning Imperial Dreadnought, the ability to ask questions, to observe operations, to understand principles rather than just copying effects. This would be a mech boy's dream. He would learn more in months of such cooperation than he could from years of studying broken wreckage. But there would be limits on both sides. The Dreadnought would never share information that directly threatens the Imperium. Strategic intelligence, navigation routes to major worlds, encryption protocols. Gronkak would never trust the Dreadnought enough to let him have full freedom, always keeping weapons trained on him, always ready to respond if he turns hostile. This uneasy partnership could last months or even years, depending on circumstances. Eventually, it would end. Maybe they reach a world with an Imperial presence, and the Dreadnought betrays his Ork allies at the first opportunity. Maybe the warboss decides the arrangement has gone on too long and orders Gronkak to just crack the thing open already. Maybe another faction attacks, forcing them to fight together or flee separately. This scenario is morally complex and psychologically fascinating. It requires both sides to act against their nature, the Dreadnought working with Xenos, the Orks showing something approaching patience and restraint. It's probably the least likely outcome, but it's not impossible. Desperation makes for strange bedfellows, and the 41st millennium is nothing if not desperate. Scenario 4. The Ork Prize. The darkest outcome is that the Orks succeed in capturing the Dreadnought intact. Through superior numbers, through clever tactics, through sheer persistence, they manage to subdue him without destroying the critical systems. Maybe they manage to drain his power reserves, forcing him into emergency shutdown. Maybe they crack the code on his stasis systems, manually forcing him back into dormancy. Maybe they just pile on enough chains and cables and mechanical restraints that he cannot move, trapped in his own body. Once captured, Gronkak and the other mech boys would begin their study in earnest. The Dreadnought would be transported to whatever passes for a mech boy workshop in this warband, probably a ramshackle structure made of looted materials and scrap. There, surrounded by crude tools and cruder minds, he would be examined, tested, taken apart piece by piece. If he remains conscious during this process, it would be the ultimate horror. Unable to move, unable to fight, unable to do anything except experience as Xenos' hands violate every sacred component of his being. They would probe his senses, trying to understand how they work. They would tap into his power plant, studying the flow of energy. They would attempt to access his memory banks, though the data encryption would likely defeat them, at least initially. The biological components would be the most disturbing discovery for the Orks. When they finally crack open the sarcophagus, when they see what's actually inside, the shriveled organic remains floating in murky amniotic fluid, their reaction would be a mixture of fascination and disgust. This is what powers this mighty war machine, this pathetic remnant of flesh. Some mech boys might try to keep the biological components alive, seeing them as potentially valuable for understanding how the control systems work. Others would dismiss them as unnecessary and focus on the mechanical aspects. The consciousness trapped inside, the Marine who has endured so long and so much, might finally face true death as the life support systems are disconnected or damaged beyond function. But even in death, his torment wouldn't necessarily end. The Orks would continue their study, taking apart the systems, learning principles, applying knowledge to their own constructions. The ancient Dreadnought would be reduced to components, to raw materials, to information that would be used to make better weapons for the enemies of humanity. Everything he represented, everything he stood for, would be perverted into serving the greenskin war machine. This is perhaps the outcome the Imperium would fear most. Not just the loss of a hero, but the desecration of what he represented and the empowerment of the enemy with knowledge stolen from his sacred form. The meaning in the darkness. As we come to the end of this exploration, we need to step back and consider what this scenario tells us about the nature of existence in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. This isn't just a story about a space marine dreadnought and some orcs. It's a meditation on time, loss, duty, and the cost of service that extends beyond what any being should be asked to pay. The dreadnought represents the Imperium's approach to everything: preserve, endure, never surrender, never let go. Death is not an ending because duty never ends. The warrior who should have died with honor on some forgotten battlefield thousands of years ago is instead preserved, his consciousness maintained through technology and will, forced to continue serving, even when everything that gave that service context has faded into history. There's something profoundly tragic about this. The Imperium lauds the dreadnoughts as honored heroes, and they are, but they're also prisoners. Their consciousness trapped in metal tombs, existing in a state between life and death, never allowed the release of true ending. And when that existence extends across thousands of years, when the hero sleeps through so much history that he wakes as a stranger in a strange land, the honor starts to feel more like cruelty. The Orks, in contrast, represent a kind of purity in their violence. They fight because fighting is what they were made for, and they enjoy it thoroughly. When an Ork dies in battle, he dies satisfied, knowing he had a good scrap. When an Ork finds loot, he's delighted by it, uncomplicated by questions of heresy or proper procedure. They're terrible enemies, brutal and destructive, but there's an honesty to them that the Imperium lacks. The collision of these two forces, the ancient preserved warrior and the brutally simple Xenos, creates a scenario that highlights the absurdity and tragedy of the 40k universe. The Imperium's greatest strengths, its ability to preserve knowledge and heroes across vast spans of time, its dedication to duty and service, become weaknesses when pushed to extremes. The Dreadnought should be a symbol of hope, proof that the Imperium's heroes never truly die. Instead, he becomes a symbol of suffering, a consciousness that endures long past when it should have been allowed to rest. There's also something to be said about the nature of time and identity. We are, in large part, defined by our contexts. by the people we know and serve with, by the shared experiences that create meaning. Strip away that context. Leave someone isolated from everything they knew for thousands of years. And what remains? Is the Dreadnought who wakes after so long still the same person who went to sleep? Or has the temporal gulf eroded identity to the point where only the shell remains? A collection of memories and directives that no longer cohere into a coherent self. These are questions that the Imperium doesn't want to ask, because the answers would undermine the entire mythology of the Dreadnought program. Better to maintain the fiction that these are honored heroes serving eternally in glory, than to acknowledge that they might be suffering in ways we can barely comprehend, their identities fragmenting across vast gulfs of time, their service continuing not out of genuine choice, but because the machinery won't let them stop. The scenario we've explored is extreme, yes. Most dreadnoughts aren't lost for thousands of years. Most don't wake to find themselves surrounded by enemies with no idea where or when they are. But the potential for this nightmare exists in every dreadnought, every time one is put into stasis. The possibility that something will go wrong, that they'll be forgotten or lost, that they'll wake to circumstances that break whatever sanity they have left. And yet, despite all this darkness, there's also a kind of defiant heroism in it. Even in the worst possible circumstances, the Dreadnought fights. Even confused and disoriented and facing impossible odds, the warrior spirit endures. Even when it would be easier to give up, to let the systems fail, to welcome the final darkness, he continues. Not because some authority is commanding him, not because he fears punishment, but because at the core of what he is, there's still the drive to serve, to protect, to fight. That persistence in the face of cosmic horror, that refusal to surrender, even when surrender would be merciful, that's the essence of the Imperium's ideology. It's simultaneously admirable and disturbing, heroic and tragic. It's what allows the Imperium to endure for 10,000 years despite everything trying to destroy it. But it's also what makes the Imperium so cruel to its own people, demanding service beyond any reasonable limit, extracting every possible value from every soul before, finally, allowing them rest. The Orks don't think about any of this, of course. To them, it's all much simpler. They found a good piece of loot. They're trying to figure out how to use it. If it fights back, that makes it more fun. If they can't capture it, they'll settle for a good scrap. And when it's all over, when the Dreadnought is either destroyed or captured or escaped, they'll move on to the next fight, the next prize, the next opportunity for violence and excitement. In a way, the Orks are free in ways the Imperium never can be. Free from the weight of history, free from the burden of preserving everything, free from the need to make every death meaningful by denying death itself. They live in the moment, uncomplicated by philosophy or regret. It's a freedom bought at the cost of everything that makes civilization possible, but it's freedom nonetheless. Conclusion. We've journeyed through one of the darkest scenarios the 41st Millennium has to offer, a Space Marine dreadnought, lost for nearly 3,000 years, awakening to find himself alone, disoriented, and surrounded by Orks who see him as the ultimate prize. We've explored the horror of temporal dislocation, the clash between Imperial and Ork perspectives on technology and war, the psychological trauma of existing so far beyond your natural time, and the various ways this nightmare scenario might resolve. The truth is, we don't know how this story ends. We don't know if the Dreadnought escapes, fights to the death, makes some uneasy arrangement with his captors, or succumbs to capture and study. We don't know if the Imperium ever learns of his fate, if his chapter still exists, if rescue is even possible. The grim darkness of the far future doesn't offer clean resolutions or happy endings. What we do know is that somewhere in the vast expanse of the galaxy, events like this are probably happening, not identical in details, but similar in essence. Ancient technology lost and found, consciousnesses preserved far beyond when they should have been allowed to rest. enemies finding what was never meant for their hands. The collision of the Imperium's desperate preservation with the brutal reality of a galaxy that cares nothing for sentiment or honor. These stories remind us why Warhammer 40,000 resonates so deeply. It's not just about the battles, or the cool miniatures, or the elaborate lore. It's about the exploration of themes that matter: duty and cost, honor and horror, the price of service and the nature of existence itself. It's about taking ideas to their absolute extremes and seeing what truths emerge from the darkness. The Dreadnought in our scenario, whoever he was, whatever his name might have been, represents something larger than just one character. He represents every being who has ever been asked to serve beyond their limits, to endure beyond what's reasonable, to sacrifice not just their lives, but their very selves for a cause larger than they are. And the tragedy is that even in the Imperium's perfect success, even when the technology works exactly as designed and the hero is preserved for thousands of years, the outcome is still suffering. So the next time you see a Dreadnought on the tabletop, or read about one in a novel, or encounter one in a game, remember what that machine represents. Not just a weapon, not just a cool piece of technology, but a consciousness trapped in metal, existing in a state between life and death, carrying memories across gulfs of time that would break normal minds, serving because the machinery won't let them stop. And remember too the Orks, brutally simple in their desires, terrifyingly effective in their methods, representing a kind of dark mirror to the Imperium's complexity. They find, they fight, they loot, and they do it all with an enthusiasm that would be admirable if it weren't so destructive. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and in war, there are no good outcomes, only various degrees of terrible. The Dreadnought and the Orks, ancient preserved warrior and joyfully destructive Xenos, locked in a struggle that neither truly understands and neither can easily escape. It's tragedy and action and horror and dark comedy all twisted together, which is what makes it quintessentially Warhammer 40,000. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into one of the most harrowing scenarios I could imagine in this universe. If you enjoyed this exploration of what happens when an ancient dreadnought meets an orc warband after sleeping for 2,750 years, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments what other dark corners of the 40k universe you'd like me to explore. The galaxy is vast, and the horrors within it are endless. Until next time, stay vigilant. The Emperor protects, but even his protection has limits, and sometimes the worst fate is not death, but enduring when you should have been allowed to rest.